the recording. We cut the video. We share the screen. And we start the slideshow. See, I'm getting the hang of this. It takes to the last week, but I'm figuring it out. Kant's prolegomena to any future metaphysics. Now, this is so Kant, right? Nothing is easy in Kant, even the title, right? So as you learned in the introduction, the preface to this book, he had written another book, which we'll talk about in great detail, The Critique of Pure Reason, which is really, really hard. Everyone in philosophy knows the book. If you talk to anyone who claims to have read the whole thing, you're probably talking to a liar. It's hard. It's really hard. So he writes an introduction. Now, if you were going to write an introduction, what would you call it? An introduction. What does Kant call his? A prolegomena. What's a prolegomena? It's an introduction. Welcome to Kant. If it can be hard, it will be. So, Immanuel Kant supposedly had an abnormally large forehead. Born 1724 to 1804. So notice we've now at least touched the 19th century. He lived his entire life in the town of Königsberg, which at one point back then was in an area called East Prussia. It's now actually controlled by Russia. It's in an area now called East Russia. They lost their P. Even though it's in no way contiguous with the rest of Russia, it's actually in the Baltics, right next to Lithuania. But the Russians occupy it because it's one of the few warm water ports that they have, right? But back when it was German, and a town famous for its 7 bridges, there's a university in it. It was considered sort of a backwater in Germany, though. But Kant lived his entire life there. And I suppose you would have to put the word lived in quotation marks. He had a very Prussian, very rigid way of being, right? He had a fixed schedule. He would get up at exactly the same time. He would work for a certain amount of time. He would take his daily walk, the same number of steps at the same time. You know, it was said that you could set your watch by the time Kant passed your door because it would be exactly the same every day. He was a very strict sort of person. And that being said, he also supposedly was very sociable, where every person would sit down and there would be a piece of paper at each place which said for each of the courses what was being served and the topic that would be discussed during that course. He started out actually more as a scientist, writing on physics, a lot on astronomy, geology, meteorology. He was interested in the science of the time, but then ultimately really turns his interest towards philosophical questions. He does become a professor, but not until he was 45 years old. And even then, it took him 11 years to produce his masterpiece, which was The Critique of Pure Reason, which is one of the most important works in the history of philosophy. There are a very small handful of figures who radically alter the direction of philosophy. I mean, you can really think of Plato and Kant as being, you know, the 2 big ones where philosophy was never the same after them. Everything to this day that is done in philosophy, in a sense, is a reaction to Kant, or a reaction to a reaction to Kant. He so shaped philosophy. It's hard, but it's really deep and it's really important. In fact, you could go to any philosophical talk on any topic. Doesn't matter if it's ethics, if it's philosophy of science, if it's philosophy of language, if it's metaphysics, it doesn't matter what it is, social, political, anything. During the question and answer period, if you want to look smart, just look at the person with a sort of interested, sort of look and say, this seems to be a reaction to Kant. I guarantee the person will then go, yes, and then launch on a 10-minute conversation. And you can pull this on any philosopher at any time. That's how important Kant is, okay? Every question we ask, how we ask it now, has all been shaped by this work that we're going to look into. So it is one of the most important philosophical pieces in the history of thought. So, we find in the preface one of the most famous quotations, woken from his dogmatic slumbers. And who awoke him? David Hume, right? So think back to Hume, the last figure we looked at, right? Who tries to blow everything up. That took Kant, who again, very rigid person with a very strict standard sort of background. He read Kant and realized, I read Hume and realized, oh my goodness, this is a challenge. This needs to be answered. So what he's written, in essence, is an attempt to take all of the problems that Hume pointed out and figure out how we can save philosophy. Hume tried to knock down the tower. Kant is going to try to rebuild it, and rebuild it in a way that makes it impervious to that sort of skepticism. And so he begins by saying this: there are scholars to whom the history of philosophy, both ancient and modern, is philosophy itself. The present prolegomena are not written for them. In other words, if you think of philosophy as just setting out the views of ancient philosophers and not advancing philosophy, then you're missing the point. This new work, Kant is telling you from the very beginning of the preface, is going to break new ground. It's going to do something new and interesting. Philosophy isn't history. Philosophy is live. He says, I have one central question. Is metaphysics possible? That seems like a weird question because it is, the heart of philosophy. He's asking, after Hume, who seemed to say that it isn't, can we even do philosophy? Can philosophy be done? He puts it this way. It seems almost ridiculous that while evidence, which pretends to be wisdom incarnate and for whose oracle everyone inquires, we should constantly turn around the same spot without making any progress, right? All the other sciences are growing, are advancing, are progressing, and yet philosophy just seems to yell and scream about the same old arguments again and again and again. Since the essays of Locke and Leibniz, or at least as far as the history of metaphysics, as far as history teaches, nothing has ever happened which could have been more decisive to its fate than the attack made upon it by David Hume. So the idea is, before Hume, philosophers were just arguing around and around and not getting anywhere, and then Hume blows the whole thing up. And so the point is, what Kant wants to say is that after Hume, there is a struggle, there is a crisis in philosophy. Philosophy might be dead. David Hume might have just killed philosophy. If Hume didn't kill philosophy, then philosophers need to explain themselves. They need to be able to account for, after Hume, how we still actually can do philosophy. Hume laid down an existential challenge. The only way to save philosophy is to answer Hume, to solve the problems that Hume set out, because they are so devastating to the entire practice of philosophy. And that is what this book is about. And then he says this, but I fear that the exposition of Hume's problem in its greatest possible extent, namely in my critique of pure reason, will fare as the problem itself fared when it was first proposed. It will be misjudged because it's misunderstood, and misunderstood because men prefer to skim through the book rather than to think it through. A disagreeable task, since the work is dry, obscure, opposed to all common ideas, and beside that, long-winded. So Kant is admitting right up front to you, he is long-winded. He is dry. He is difficult. Yes, Kant is saying this book is hard. This will not be fun. I'm not telling you it's fun. It's not fun, but it needs to be done. It's a disagreeable task. It's hard work that you don't want to do. But if we want philosophy to survive, it's work that needs to, right? He says, if somebody can do it easier, do it. Show me how it can be done in a fun, easy way, and I will pat you on the back. The fact is, you need to do the work. This is hard, but without it, philosophy is dead. We need to save philosophy, and this is the work that we need to do. So he begins with the question on the sources of metaphysics, right? So the question is metaphysics possible? So let's see where it comes from. He says, first, as concerns the sources of metaphysical cognition, its very concept implies that they cannot be fundamental propositions, but also its basic concepts must never be derived from experience. It must not be physical, but metaphysical cognition, namely cognition laying beyond the experience. It can therefore have for its basis neither outer experience, which is the source of physics proper, or inner experience, which is the basis of empirical psychology. It is therefore a priori cognition from pure understanding and pure reason. Right? So right off the bat, he's showing you where he is, right? On the epistemological front. He's not going to buy into Locke. He's not going to buy into Hume in terms of having to start as an empiricist, right? Empiricism will get you all sorts of wonderful things about physics, right? Empiricist approaches to knowledge are fine for the knowledge of the world, the knowledge of the things we observe. But if we're talking metaphysics, the nature of metaphysics is to be beyond physics. So you can't do metaphysics well, right? He's writing in German. And so clearly, this is a rationalist approach. Sort of. But the idea is when we're talking metaphysics, it's different from physics, and so it has to have a different foundation. It can't simply be answered the way that Hume sets it out as an empiricist, and to some degree, that is where Hume sort of stacks the deck, right? By being an empiricist, talking about non-empirical things, of course it's not going to work. So however we're going to get there, it ain't going to be empirical. Then he reframes the central question, right? We start with the central question, is metaphysics possible? He then sets it out in his particular way. And this is crucial to understanding everything in Kant, right? This second formulation of the central question is the question that Kant is seeking to answer. How is synthetic a priori knowledge possible? If Kant had a car and that car had a bumper sticker, that is Kant's bumper sticker. How is synthetic a priori knowledge possible? Okay, let's explain what that question means. Okay, so remember, Leibniz and then Hume distinguish between two different kinds of truths, right? There are relations of ideas and matters of fact, right? If we use Hume's terminology, very truths, right? Whose negations are contradictions and who we don't need experience and able to be able to determine. On the other hand, there are empirical facts, right? That we need the senses, right? These are matters of fact, right? Whose negation could be otherwise. The first thing that Kant realizes, and this is a deep and very important insight, is that what Leibniz and Hume had been doing is confusing two very different distinctions. They think there are only two kinds of truth because they're taking two different distinctions and thinking wrongly that they are only one distinction. In fact, there is a logical distinction, and that's synthetic analytic, and there's an epistemological distinction, a priori, a posteriori, and they are different distinctions. Let's do them each separately. Let's do the logical one first. So synthetic versus analytic. A proposition is synthetic if the meaning of the sentence outruns the meaning of the words. A sentence is analytic if the meaning of the sentence is contained simply in the meaning of the words. That is, you could know its truth or falsity simply by understanding the meanings of the words. Now, the sentences he's thinking of, he's working off of an assumption that you could use Aristotelian logic. That is, that all sentences could be written as categorical propositions. All A's are B's, some A's are B's, some A's are not B's, no A's are B's, right? For those who took logic, A-E-I-O sentences, remember those? So the idea here is a sentence is analytic if the predicate is contained in the subject. So consider the sentence, roses are flowers. That's an analytic sentence because to be a rose, part of the definition is to be a flower. So if you know what it is to be a rose and you know what it is to be a flower, then you will know that the sentence, a rose is a flower, is true, analytically. On the other hand, a synthetic proposition is one where the predicate is not contained in the subject. Roses are red. All right, now, if you know the definition of being a rose, redness is not a necessary property, right? You could be a yellow rose if you're from Texas. You could be a white rose, right? The idea here is that the redness is an accidental property. So to know whether roses are red is true or not, you need to know more than just the words. The content of the sentence is more than just what is contained within the definitions of the words. So an analytic proposition, you can know its truth by analysis, by analyzing the words, by understanding the meanings of their definitions. A synthetic proposition, you can understand the meanings of all the words and still not know whether it's true or not. So Steve is Steve. That's an analytic proposition. It's true by virtue of the definitions, right? One of the necessary conditions to be Steve is to be Steve. Steve is wearing pants is a synthetic proposition, right? Because having pants on is not necessarily part of the definition of being saying Steve the whole time, right? So the idea here is that, you know, an analytic proposition, right, is one in which the truth or falsity is based on whether the predicate is contained within the subject, and a synthetic, the predicate is not necessarily part of the subject. So it's a logical distinction. On the other hand is the epistemological distinction, the a priori, a posteriori distinction. A proposition is a priori if I can know whether it's true or not without any experience, without any sensation. A sentence is a posteriori if I need sense perception, if I need to make observations to know whether it's true or false. So the sentence, it's raining out, is a posteriori. Maybe it's raining, maybe it's not raining. I need to look out the window to see if it's true or not. Right? A triangle has 3 sides. That's a priori. I don't need to go check triangles to see whether that's true. Right? I can do it without sense experience. Now, Hume and Leibniz thought these were the same distinction. They thought all synthetic propositions are a posteriori and all analytic propositions are a priori. And so they thought that if you look at the table here on the computer screen, that the analytic a priori box would be filled in with everything that's in logic and mathematics. The synthetic a posteriori would be filled in with everything that's observed and with science. And then there would be X's in the other 2 corners. Synthetic a priori doesn't exist. Analytic a posteriori doesn't exist. It's only analytic a priori and synthetic a posteriori that are our 2 possibilities. Kant's big insight is that there's actually a 3rd kind of truth. Yes, there are analytic a priori propositions. Steve is Steve. That's analytic. It doesn't really say anything beyond its terms. And it's a priori. You don't have to check to make sure that Steve is still Steve. All right? Bachelors are unmarried. Analytic a priori. Right? If you know what bachelor means and you know what married means, you know a priori that it's true because the predicate is contained within the subject. Right? Synthetic a posteriori, still going to be there. It's raining out. I have a brother, right? These are things you need to observe in the world. So those 2 kinds of truths still exist. But, Kant says, there's a 3rd kind of truth, an importance and Hume miss. These are the synthetic a priori truths. They are synthetic. That is, they're more than just tautologies. They say something. They're sentences with real content beyond the meanings of the words. But they're sentences I know a priori. They're sentences we can know without having to look at the world. Those, Kant wants to say, are the propositions of metaphysics. And so Hume, by wrongly limiting us to only the 2 kinds of truth, then says, well, look, metaphysics isn't the one in the top right-hand corner, and it's not the one in the bottom left-hand corner, and those are the only 2 possible, so there can't be any metaphysical knowledge. And Kant is saying, no, Hume, there's a 3rd possibility. The upper left-hand corner is a real possibility. That's where metaphysics lives. So Hume was only able to destroy metaphysics by ruling out the category that actually contains the metaphysics. So the question then is, how is that corner, that top left corner, how is that sort of knowledge possible, right? Hume and Leibniz didn't even realize there was such a thing. There is. That's what metaphysics is. So if we want to ask, how is metaphysics possible? What we're really asking is, how is synthetic a priori knowledge possible? That's the question. And he says, let me give you an obvious example of synthetic a priori knowledge, right? So the idea is everyone other than, there are only the two kinds of truths. There isn't this magical, weird third kind of truth. And Kant says, yeah, there is. In fact, you all know it very, very well. Every single one of you studied it in high school. Math. Mathematical judgments as a whole are synthetic. This fact seems altogether to have escaped the notice of those who have analyzed human reason until now. It even seems directly opposed to all their conjectures, despite the fact that it is incontestably certain and has very important consequences. And so the idea is he considers mathematics. The sentence he usually considers is 7 plus 5 equals 12. Now, that's true, right? Yes. But he says that's not an analytic truth, right? It is a priori, right? We can know 7 plus 5 equals 12. You can have your two hands and then have to take off your shoes, right? The point is we don't need to count fingers and toes. We don't need to have 7 things and 5 things and put them together and observe. You can know it a priori, but that doesn't mean it's analytic. You can know everything about sevenness. You can know everything about fividity. And combining sevenness and fividity, you're not going to come out with 12ism, right? It is true that 7 plus 5 equals 12, but that's an extra fact that comes even if you know everything about 7 and everything about 5. It's a priori, but it's not analytic, it's synthetic. I've always thought the better example would have been, and he refers to these in a later section, the axioms of Euclid, right? Is it true that around any point you can draw a circle of any size? Yeah, that's true, but that's not part of the definition of a point, is what a circle is, and not know this fact. This fact goes beyond knowing what points and circles are. It's a priori. You don't have to go to every single spot possible in space and draw every possible circle around it. You just know it, right? It is a priori, but it is an interesting proposition. That is not a tautology, right? That says that you can do this really interesting thing. This has content. This is a synthetic proposition, and yet it's a priori. And so with the truths of arithmetic, and I think even better illustrated, excuse me, with the truths of Euclid and the postulates, we have propositions that are a priori, but which are synthetic. And the point of this section is for Kant to give you truths that are universally accepted, but are part of this new class of sentences, things that he wants to term metaphysical. I was going to say, look, not every proposition in mathematics is synthetic. There are some analytic propositions in mathematics. Anything equals itself. The whole is bigger than the part. Yeah. But that doesn't mean that there aren't these synthetic ones. And those, in fact, are the important ones. And since we use the axioms, right, we use the postulates, we use the synthetic ones in all of their derivations, that makes all the rest of science synthetic as well. And so he wants to say, mathematics is metaphysical. So metaphysics is possible. But the question is how? How does it work? So his question is, how is pure mathematics possible? And he starts this with a Kantian word. You will not hear this word anywhere other than in people who are talking about Kant, but it's a crucial Kantian term that you need to know, apodictic. A proposition is apodictic if it's absolutely necessary and unrevisable in light of experience. That is, there is no belief in this proposition. Okay, so when he calls certain sentences apodictic, that means they're not just true, they're necessarily true, and there's nothing you could see in the world that would force you to change your mind. Then he goes to another important word, intuition. Now, the first time you read Kant, you assume that he means by intuition what we mean by intuition. That is just something you just sort of know. Well, no, this is a technical term for Kant, right? The intuition is the faculty by which there are representations that would depend immediately upon the presence of an object. That is, the intuition is basically the box where we keep all of our ideas, right? So you'll remember in Hume, we first went about building ideas, and then we created propositions once we added the associations, right? And so propositions are things that could be true or false. They could be known or not, right? Objects, to know an object, to know an idea is different from a proposition, right? The propositions are going to be in the understanding. The ideas are going to be in the intuition. So think of the intuition as the box in which you keep your individual ideas. So we're not talking propositions about the ideas. We're just talking about the ideas themselves, right? Those are kept in the intuition. And he says there's a distinction between the empirical intuition and the pure intuition. So empirical intuition, any ideas you get from your senses, yellow, hot, sour, lemon, right? Those are all ideas that are empirical ideas, so they come in through, they get stored in the empirical intuition. Pure for Kant, right, means not based on experience. So anything that requires observation is not pure. Pure means of the mind itself. So anytime you see pure reason, pure intuition, pure understanding, right? Anytime you see the word pure in Kant, what he means is of the mind itself, in no way connected with observations of the world. So the pure intuition is going to contain these ideas that we have that don't come from the world, right? So ideas in the mind that don't come from the external world, what does that sound a whole lot like? Descartes' innate ideas, right? Yeah. What Kant is ultimately going to do, give away the punchline a little bit here, is he's going to take this rationalist empiricist debate and he's going to in elements of both. So the empirical intuition is going to be needed for knowledge. That's where the empiricists get it right. But there is also pure intuition. There are also ideas that are innate within the mind. And this is where we're going to see a hat tip towards Cartesian rationalism. So the question then is about this pure intuition. How can there be a pure intuition? How can we have concepts without experiencing the thing that it's a concept of? Well, he says there's only one way in which my intuition can anticipate the actuality of the object and be an a priori cognition. But the form of the sensibility that proceeds in me as a subject, all the actual impressions through which I am affected by the object. So what's in the pure intuition? What sort of ideas, what sort of concepts? The ones that are there, which are the form that precedes the object. Here he's pulling a little bit on a distinction that we could trace back to Aristotle, right? All things, Aristotle wants to say, have both a form and a content, right? There's a formal cause and a material cause. So if we think of a statue, right, the material cause will be the marble that makes up the statue. The formal cause will be the structure of it. And that notion of form goes back to Plato as something immaterial, as something ideal, right? That's what Kant is going to mean in the sense of form of the sensibility here, right? These are pure in the way that Plato might think of the forms being in, this perfect unchanging realm, not down here in the imperfect sensible world. And what we need, vis-a-vis Aristotle, is both form and content. And what the pure intuition will give us is some sense of the form, and the senses will give us some sense of the content. And so mathematics, we'll see, is really just about the forms which pre-exist for the possibility of sensation. So what are these forms that precede experience? And he says there are two of them, space and time, right? Again, these are form without content. Space is a place where things could be. Time is the flow in which things exist for there to even be a world. They are, and this is an important Kantian phrase, the preconditions for the possibility of experience. So they aren't the experiences, they're the preconditions that have to be in place for experiences even to be possible. And there are going to be ones that are, he terms, outer and ones that he terms inner. Geometry is based upon the pure intuition of space. Arithmetic brings about its concept of number by the successive addition of units in time. Both representations, however, are mere intuitions. For if we leave everything empirical, namely everything that belongs to sensation, out of the empirical intuitions of bodies, which are therefore pure intuitions a priori, and for that reason can never be omitted. So the idea here is remove all of the objects. What's left? Space. Remove all of the events. What's left? Time. Now, do you ever see space? No. Do you ever see time? No. But they are still there when you remove all the things that you do see. And so they must exist a priori as the preconditions for those experiences. So the is the form of outer intuition. Time is the sense of inner intuition, right? Time flows linearly, right? Its moments are laid out on a timeline, which is a number line. And so the idea of number comes from the flow of time, right? All of this is packed in the intuition as innate ideas that have to be there for us to even have empirical experiences. So we do have empirical experiences and they do bring us information, but in order for them to be possible, there have to be these things in place first. And that's what he means by the pure intuition. So notice what that says about mathematics. It's not true of the world. Geometry isn't true of space. It's true of how we understand the nature of space, right? This is pure. Remember, for him, pure means of the mind. So when we're studying mathematics, what we're really studying is how we make sense of the world, how we set it up so that our empirical observations could happen. Pure mathematics as synthetic a priori cognition is possible only by referring to no objects other than those of the senses whose empirical intuitions presupposes a pure and even a priori intuition of space and time. This is possible because pure intuition is nothing but the mere form of sensibility, which precedes the actual appearance of the objects, in that it in fact makes them possible in the first place. Without internal, pre-existing, innate concepts of space and time, we couldn't have observations. And so when we study arithmetic, when we study geometry, we're studying pure mathematics. Normally, pure mathematics is distinguished from applied mathematics. Here, for Kant, pure mathematics means the mathematics that is contained within the mind itself. What we are doing when we study math is actually studying how the mind itself is structured. Mathematics is a branch of psychology. And to show this, which is, it's kind of a weird argument. He gives an even weirder argument, but it's a famous one. And that is his argument from handedness, right? Now, you probably read it and thought, what is going on here? Why is he talking about looking at your hand in the mirror? Okay, a little bit of background. What he's doing is giving a third option for the nature of space. There had been 2 generations before a very vigorous argument over the nature of space between Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz. Newton is a substantivalist. He says that space is itself a real thing. If you took all of the objects in space and you removed them, what are you left with? You're left with space, and space is a real object. And in the Principia, he gives an argument using a rotating bucket filled with water. That is, what you see is when the bucket, so you take a bucket, fill it halfway with water, right? You look at it, the surface is flat. You hang it by a rope from a tree, you wind up the rope, right? Just before you let it go, right? The water is still, the bucket is still, the water is flat. Let the bucket go. So the water is still, the bucket is spinning around the water. So now there's relative motion between them and the water is still flat. Eventually, because of friction, the water will start rotating with the bucket. And as the water rotates, its surface becomes concave, right? That is, right? It recedes up the edges of the bucket. Then you grab the bucket, you stop it. The water's still spinning, the bucket is still, and yet the water is still receding up the sides of the bucket. And so the idea here is when the water and the bucket are spinning together, and when they're still together, there is no relative motion. And yet there's a difference in the shape of the water, right? In the case where the bucket is held and the water is spinning, right? Now there is relative motion between them. In the first case where the bucket is spinning but the water is still, there is relative motion. But in one case, the water is receding up the side, and the other, the water is perfectly flat. So the idea is there must be absolute motion, and absolute motion, Newton argues, requires both absolute space and absolute time. They must be real things unto themselves. Space is a metaphysical entity independent of us. Leibniz argues no. Leibniz argues space does not exist. If you take everything out of space, nothing's left. Space is not a thing. Space is just a set of geometric relations among the things. And if you kept all the geometric relations the same, you'd have the same world. And he does this in an argument with Samuel Clarke, who actually was Isaac Newton. Newton was so angry at Leibniz at this point that he wasn't talking to him. And so he had to use his friend Samuel Clarke as a go-between. But it's clear that the letters between them were really written by Leibniz and Newton. And Leibniz says, let's take all of space and let's turn it east into west and west into east. That is, perfectly reflect all of nature so everything remains in exactly the same relations. Is there any difference between this world and that world? And the answer is no. there is no difference whatsoever. So, by the principle of sufficient reason, remember that from Leibniz, there would be no reason for God to prefer one of these universes over the other. And since there has to be a sufficient reason, if those were different universes, God could not have picked which one to create, and so God could not have created the universe, but God did create the universe. So they have to be the same, just different descriptions of the same thing, and so space does not exist. It's just the set of geometric relations. So Newton says that space is a real metaphysical thing with its own reality. Leibniz is saying space does not exist at all. It's just the set of geometric relations among things. Along comes Kant and is saying, hey, Newton and Leibniz, you're both wrong. Space is metaphysical. And in that sense, Newton is right, but it doesn't have an independent existence as a thing. It is geometric relations like Leibniz says, but it's not merely the set of geometric relations. And to show that, he gives the argument about hands and gloves. He says, look, suppose your hands were perfect mirror images of each other, right? Your left hand and your right hand are, so when you take your right hand and you see it in the mirror, it looks like a left hand, but with all of the properties geometrically of your right hand. So suppose that mirror right hand, which is a left hand, were your real left hand, right? Now, that means your right hand and your left hand are identical in terms of the sorts of geometric relations. And so according to Leibniz, they'd have to be, in essence, the same hand. Well, if that's true, go ahead and put your left glove on your right hand. You can't do it. So what that means is that while Leibniz is right, that space is in a certain sense just the geometric relations among the things, it's got to be a little bit more than that, but not so much as what Newton said. So what Kant is saying, by making space this sense of the outer intuition, is it is metaphysical the way Newton wants, but it's not a metaphysical thing like Newton wants. It is a set of geometric relations like Leibniz wants, but that gives it a reality that's more than what Leibniz was willing to have. So what he's showing there is that he's taking a sort of middle ground in this argument over the metaphysics of space. He then says this, and this is a concept we will need for next time. This is a central idea in Kant. Since we have just shown that the senses never and in no way enable us to know things in themselves, but only their appearances, which are mere representations of sensibility, we conclude that all bodies, together with the space in which they are found, must be considered nothing but mere representations in us and exist nowhere but in our thoughts. Remember what we've been calling all semester the central problem of metaphysics. We have these internal experiences about the world. How do we know that what's in our mind in any way resembles that which gave rise to it? How do we know that there is a world that looks like the experiences in our minds? Okay, two words that Kant will use in a bit, right? The noumena is the external world, the external mind-independent things in themselves. The phenomena are the internal representations, are the lived experience. And what Kant is saying very clearly is that the only thing we have access to are the phenomena. You have no access, the world is out there. So here he's sort of going along with Hume, right? We are trapped in our heads. We are trapped in our internal world of experiences. We can't say that, along with, say, Locke, that there are primary qualities that actually correspond to an external real world. We don't know that. We can't know that. All we know are the appearances. All we know are the phenomena. We are stuck in our heads. So that raises an interesting question then, right? How is natural science possible? If we can never know things in themselves, what is science the science of? Well, he says it's the science nature. Well, what is nature? The existence of things insofar as it's determined according to universal laws. So nature requires a law-like behavior of the internal experiences. Question? Okay. So there are empirical concepts that we need for science: motion, impenetrability, inertia, right? So he's not saying the way someone like Descartes would want to, that we could derive all of science deductively from our innate ideas. No, we need to get some of these ideas from experience. But there are certain pure aspects, certain pure elements, certain elements that the mind itself is a metaphysical foundation for natural science. Things like conservation of mass, right? That things can't be created or destroyed. The principle of sufficient reason, right? The idea that there are laws that govern how nature works. We just presuppose that in looking for the laws, right? That is a form, right? That's part of the intuition. That's pure. That's just from the mind itself, which is then augmented by the things we get from the senses. And so there is going to be a pure metaphysical component, not only to mathematics, but also to natural science. And this runs us smack dab into Hume's problem, right? Notice what it is that this form that's required for the existence of science. It requires that there be necessary connections between events. But what did Hume argue? He argued explicitly, right? This is what we looked at last time, that the human mind can never in any coherent way come up with a justification for the notion of necessary connection. But science presupposes necessary connection because you can't have laws of nature without having this concept of necessary connection. Hume saying it's just a mental habit. And if it's just a mental habit, then it's unjustified. If it's unjustified, then it isn't real. Kant says, okay, that's a serious problem. We need to solve that. We can do it, Kant says. Let's start by distinguishing between two kinds of judgments. Now, judgments are different from ideas, okay? This is an important distinction in Kant, right? The ideas and the intuition are just the individual concepts. Judgments are sentences, propositions that are true or false. And we make judgments of experience, and we need to contrast those with judgments of perception. Now, that may seem like a weird distinction to draw, because what's the difference between an experience and a perception? He says the difference is to perceive something. You have a perception. You see the lemon. You taste the lemon, right? That is a subjective personal experience. What you can then do is turn it into what he calls an experience, which is now an objective thing. It's more than just your personal perception of it. It is a universal claim about the thing. Science is not about relations of our judgments of perceptions. It's about objective judgments of experience. Okay. So again, the distinction between the intuition and the understanding, right? The intuition gives us sort of the objects, the stuff. So if you go back to Hume, right, remember we had ideas and then we had to have associations. And once we had the ideas and associations, we could then have propositions, right? That's the sort of thing that Kant is doing here, right? The intuition gives us the ideas. The understanding is the ideas plus the associations, right? Remember, Hume thought there were only three associations: resemblance, contiguity, cause and effect. And he said, look, I'm not married to three. There's no magic number, right? Those are the only three I could come up with. If you could tell me there's more, fine, great, there's more. You just have to show me. Kant reads that and says, okay, there's something deep there, that these associations need to be added to the ideas in order to get propositions, right? That we can move from from intuition, from objects to judgments, to understanding, to knowledge, only when we add these extra components, these things that stick the ideas together in order to make them propositions. So he's taking that idea from Hume. He's going to say, okay, there are going to be more than three. I can come up with a whole bunch more, right? But Hume is right. Think about cause and effect, right? He says, you can observe A, you can observe B, you never observe the causal nexus. So how do we justify cause and effect? It can't be empirically, it can't be deductively, it can't be inductively. Ooh, maybe it's in terms of this new category of truth. So he's going to take Hume's idea, but instead of seeing it as a defeat for knowledge, he's actually going to take it as a structure for knowledge. And that's what gives us the categories. Okay? This is a crucial element in Kant, right? You saw this, very famous chart that he sets out, the transcendental table of pure concepts of the understanding. What these are Kant's version of Hume's associations, right? Remember that the associations are like the mortar and the ideas are the bricks. So the ideas that we get through the pure and empirical intuition, we get our ideas. We now need to stick them together with associations in order to create propositions, or what Kant calls judgments. And instead of three, he says there are 12. And they come in 4 categories, which he numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4: quantity, quality, relation, and modality. Right? So he says, okay, Hume, you think it's possible there are more than 3? I got 12. You're 3 plus 9 others. And he arranges them in 4 nice groups of 3. And he wants to say that these are, exactly as Hume said, elements that come from the human mind. Right? Now, for Hume, that meant they were false. They were nonsense, because he's an empiricist. You can't get them from the world, therefore you can't get them. Kant is going to be a rationalist. He's going to say, okay, look, Descartes was wrong in saying everything's an innate idea, but there are innate ideas. And those innate ideas are the preconditions for the possibility of making judgments. They're the preconditions for the possibility of having experiences. So those preconditions, those associations, Hume is right to give, right? And notice how Hume does it in his typical snarky way, saying, well, they can't be true, so I won't justify their truth, but I will give an explanation as to why you think they're true. So you wrongly believe they're true. Here's why you believe this false thing. They're not justified, but there is a why you think they're justified. And that's because of habits of the mind. Kant says, you were so close, Hume. You're right to put it in the mind, but that is the justification for them. It's not that we put them in the mind because they can't be justified. It's that they pre-exist in the mind as innate ideas, which is what creates the possibility of those propositions that can be justified. So we have our 12 categories that pre-exist within the structure of the human mind that allow us to take ideas, some of which aren't true, and that is what the faculty of the understanding does. So the faculty of the intuition gives us all the bricks. The mind implicitly has the categories, which is the mortar to stick those bricks together. We can stick them together in good ways or bad ways. The good ways give us true propositions. The bad ways give us false propositions. And that's what the understanding is able to determine. So the understanding gives us these categories, which lets us take the ideas and create our propositions. And then we see which are true and which are false. And so notice what we find in the categories. Things like cause, necessity, probability, right? All of those things that Hume says we need, but we can't justify. Hume appropriates all of them. And instead of saying they're habits of the mind, he's saying, no, they're the structure of the mind. So he enlarges this list of associations and says, look, the problem that Hume has, the only reason that Hume was able to say that this blows up metaphysics is because he's an empiricist, because he doesn't even allow for the idea of these innate ideas. These are the innate ideas, the internal world. Descartes was wrong about that. Descartes leaned way too heavy on the innate ideas, but there are innate ideas. There are these pure concepts, right, that we have. And the pure concepts are added to the empirical concepts. And when you put them together, now you have experiences. So it's a combination of the two, right? He says, the given intuition must be subsumed under a concept, which determines the form of judging in general with respect to the intuition, right? The form of judging, right? Are these cause and effect? Are these similar to each other? Are these more numerous than those, right? They're subsumed under a concept which determines the form of judging in general. And this connects its empirical consciousness in consciousness in general, and thereby establishes universal validity for empirical judgment. Such a concept is a pure a priori concept of the understanding, which does nothing but determine for an intuition a general way in which it can be used for judgments, a general way. So we're not looking at particular judgments, we're looking at the general structure of the judgments, and that comes from the structure of the mind. When we want to look at particular ones, we need to add the concept that comes in through the senses, and we determine, did this cause that? Is this probably going to happen? Is this a necessary consequence of? Are there multiple computers in front of me or just one? Right? All of these things, the general form of the judgment comes from the mind. It's pure. The particulars of this specific judgment come from the senses combined with. And so we get to the punchline. Here we have Kant's solution to the rationalist empiricist debate, right? Who's right, the rationalist or the empiricist? Does knowledge come from human reason or does it come through the senses? And Kant's answer is yes. Empiricism gets a lot of things right, but as Hume showed, simple empiricism can't get it all right. It needs to, as Hume almost said, require the workings of the mind. Now, Hume thought that meant that it was disqualified as legitimate knowledge. Kant is sort of appropriating Hume and taking him that one step farther and saying, no, 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 you're right, Hume. It does come from the human mind, but it comes from the human mind as a precondition, not as an after the fact justification. There are these, without them, you couldn't even have observation. So yeah, the empiricists to some degree are right, but you can't have empiricism without rationalism. And so what Kant does is create his own very intricate hybrid. And as a result, we now have an understanding of analytic a priori truths. We now have an understanding of a posteriori synthetic truths. And we now have an understanding of synthetic a priori truths. Truths you guys didn't even think existed. We now know they not only exist, we know what they are and how they're justified. And as a result, Kant wants to say, we now have all of our knowledge. We've solved the epistemological problem. But this is modern philosophy, which means that metaphysics comes from epistemology. Having fixed the epistemological problem, what's the metaphysic that comes out of it? And remember, that was the question. How is metaphysics possible? Well, he showed how it's possible. Let's see what it consists of. And that will be the subject of our next and last conversation. We'll see you then.